Hello and welcome to the Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. Also, last week, we did skip a week, but perhaps in a good week to do so. You can check out the episode description for the list of all the articles we discuss and the timestamps. I am one of your regular hosts, Andrey Kurenkov. My background is of having studied AI in grad school and now being at a Gen AI startup.
And I'm your other regular host, Jeremie Harris. I'm the co-founder of Gladstone AI. I do a bunch of AI national security stuff. And we were talking about this last week. It felt like a real nothing burger of a week. And for various reasons, we ended up not recording the podcast that week. And we're kind of like, people aren't really going to miss anything. There was the odd thing, and there is the odd thing. We'll surface it this week. But then all of a sudden, two open source models from OpenAI, GPT-5 drops, Claude 4.1. We have Gemini 2.5 Deep Thinking dropped. We're just like so many things. And obviously for every one of these drops, there is the model card or the system card. There is the obligatory meter eval suite. There is all the stuff that we have to go through. So there is a lot of stuff to cover today.
Yeah, it feels like this has happened multiple times this year. Like all the major players to do things all around the same time, presumably to, get the attention of everyone and not be left behind. And this was definitely one of those weeks where we saw a cluster of major stories. So yeah, we're going to definitely talk about GPT-5 quite a bit, Opus 4.1. And then on the business front, actually, some interesting stories, updates on revenue, on potential raises, and whole bunch of stuff to discuss. One more quick thing before we get into the actual discussion of the stories. Want to do a quick plug for the thing I'm working on, Astrocade. We recently rolled out a major update. I'm going to plug it with a link in the episode description. There's a whole article. Astrocade rolls out AI agent-powered game creation experience. We went all in on vibe coding as we had to. So
amazing.
If you want to vibe code some games, check out the episode description to see what I am working on most of the time and why the podcast sometimes is late.
Can we do a Last Week in AI game?
Of course. I can do it.
We need to do a Last Week in AI game. We got to figure out what that even means, but
yeah, I think I'm going to do OpenAI versus Anthropic. It's like a fighting game where you pick the major players.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Alrighty, well, with all that said, let's get into all the big stories of the week, starting in tools and apps. And of course, we're going to begin with GPT-5. This just happened yesterday. There was one of OpenAI's big live streams. Pretty much everyone knew this was going to happen for most of the past week. And what we saw was, I would say, an interesting development in the sense that, first, OpenAI deprecated all their other models. GPT-5 is the only model for OpenAI now. What GPT-5 seems to be is all their models combined into one. So if you're a user on chatgpt.com and you enter a query, there's a router that takes your query and either takes it to a complicated reasoning model or to a simpler model, kind of like O3 versus GPT-4o. And as you might expect with this kind of thing, there were announcements of various improvements on benchmarks, on SW bench verified, on GPT diamonds, these kinds of things. To sum up what I think is the general impression on like the empirical front, the vibe check, GPT-5 is an all-around good model. It's an improvement. It's up there with all the other leading models, Gemini 2.5 Pro and Claude 4 and so on. It's not a huge leap. It appears to be, at least in part, more of a product update and an infrastructure update for OpenAI than necessarily like a whole new model. The knowledge cutoff is September of 2024. So there's a lot of reasons to think this is kind of a mix of training and just infrastructure and development. And that's my take, but Jeremie, feel free to say what you took away.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one modification there, a slight thing would be they did release updated versions of all of the kind of, not the base models, but all the feeder models, the models that get routed to. So this is both a router, as you said, that takes your query and routes it, but also an upgrade to the downstream models that do the computations, that do the generation. So in that sense, yeah, is like, what is it really? It certainly is a system more than any one model. So they say that they plan, in quotes, the near future to integrate all these capabilities into a single model. This is a vision that Sam has expressed for a long time, right? This idea that it feels silly that people are using a model selector to choose between different models isn't the most natural way to interact with an LLM, just to like pose your question and have the system decide which submodel to handle it, or to have one model that decides how much effort to invest in each query in a way that's a bit more appropriate. If he's right with that play, then the bit of kind of bumping and bruising that's happening right now, because there are people complaining about the fact that they want to use certain models. What happened to GPT 4.0? There's this whole kind of hashtag save GPT 4.0 like mini trend on Twitter. All this stuff, like that's probably going to be viewed, if Sam is right, as a sort of kind of ships that pass in the night thing. People aren't going to think about it. This sets OpenAI up in an interesting position to experiment earlier than other labs with that user experience component of, what if we have a single model to rule them all, or a single interface? So that's interesting, but we don't know how that plays out, right? It may just be the case that people want that level of control. They want to be able to select their models, and that is a persistent thing, possibly. Who knows? The other piece is some of the evals. So the hallucination rate on the system really is a lot lower than what we've seen with previous models. A sixth of O3's hallucination rate, a fifth of O3's error rate in thinking mode. So a lot of effort has been put in seemingly to making the model's outputs more reliable, more truthful, and so on, which is useful. This is all part of a new direction to not quite alignment, but like kind of safety fine tuning that OpenAI is taking, where they're now centering their refusal mechanism on the assistance output rather than some kind of binary classification of the user's intent. So in the past, you would write a query to ChatGPT. There'd be a classifier that looks at your query and decides, is this a safe request, or is this somebody asking, how do I bury a dead body? How do I make a bomb type thing? And depending on that output, that would feed into the response that you got. But what they're doing instead here is they're saying, okay, let's just like take whatever query, whatever request the user makes, and let's focus on the output that we're generating, the model's going to generate in response, and sort of like modify that to take out anything that seems dangerous or whatever. So what you tend to see as a result is less focus on a knee-jerk reflex, like, no, I won't answer that question, and more the model trying to answer as much as it can while obfuscating the narrow bits that it considers to be dangerous. And so there's a whole paper on this. I'll kind of just tell you guys, this paper dropped yesterday as part of the flurry of releases. I have read all of like 2 pages of that paper, and that's where this explanation comes from. So expect us to cover that in more detail next week. But anyway, this is an interesting release. Last thing I will say is there is a meter eval suite that came out, of course, as they do with all the frontier model releases. A couple notes here. So Meter received access to GPT-5 4 weeks prior to its release. That is an interesting improvement over previous rounds of Meter evals, which, if I recall, involved them having like a week of access or 2 weeks. And there were some complaining about that. And so that seems to have been fixed or addressed. And so the key number when you think about the Meter evals is this 50% time horizon metric, right? So this is answering the question, for what length of time that it would take a human to perform a task, does this model hit a 50% success rate? So think of like a whole bunch of different tasks. Some of them take humans 5 minutes to complete. Some of them take humans 5 hours to complete. What is the length of that task such that the model has a 50-50 chance of succeeding at it, right? And so previous models we'd seen hit like, an hour and 45 minutes type thing. Well, this one is 2 hours and 17 minutes. And the important thing to note here is that this really starts to suggest that there is a new trend forming. So historically, what Meter did was they looked at all the model releases for all the frontier models starting in 2019 all the way up to the present day. And then they kind of plotted a line of best fit. And that line of best fit told them, hey, we are basically doubling the length of the tasks that these models can complete autonomously every 7 months. And actually, this was something we talked about on Rogan. Like this is kind of the big trend. We also talked about on Rogan at the time. I think it was like one of the Claude models had just been released, and we were just getting a sense that, hey, if you actually look at the plot, there's kind of like a steeper slope that's starting to appear in just the like most recent 3 or 4 models. Well, we now have like 5 more data points, and it is really starting to look like that line is real. That new line has a 4-month doubling time. And so if you extrapolate that out, you're looking at hitting like a month-long fully automated task sometime in like 2028-ish. So, depending on which slope you choose, right, the 7-month one gives you 2031. And if you think of a month-long task as being kind of AGI-ish, that should affect your thinking about timelines. And so a lot of ambiguity here, but we're starting to get a little bit of clarity on the genuine acceleration that does seem to be happening on the scaling side.
Yeah, I don't know. Personally, I think the methodology has a lot of flaws, but we are still seeing advancements, so that's fair to say. A couple more notes about GPT-5. If you're an API user, so part of this is, of course, trying to still fight the enterprise for API users of the models. They have 3 variants of GPT-5. So they have GPT-5, kind of the normal one, GPT-5 Mini, and GPT-5 Nano, similar to how Claude has Opus, Sonnet, and Haiku, and different sizes, different costs, different speeds, etc. Currently, they are undercutting Anthropic on price by a pretty significant margin. So if you look at the input and output costs, the output cost per million token is about 2/3 of what Claude Sonnet is. Some other, technical details here. The input context window is larger than before for OpenAI at 400,000 tokens. That's still not quite as high as Gemini at 1 million. So still there are other models that are leading in that regard, but hopefully, OpenAI is starting to push more on that front. The max output tokens is 128,000, which is quite a bit larger than GPT-4o, for instance. And let me just check here. Also larger than GPT-4.1, although GPT-4.1 could take in 1 million tokens. So interesting set of parameters being chosen here as far as kind of the usage profile. And I definitely do think there is some credibility to the idea that this is both an update on the technical front in terms of training and the weights and so on, and kind of more of a product update where they had all 3, GPT-4o, GPT-4.1, O1 mini. Like, I was getting confused at this point, right? Like, it was insane. So for OpenAI to go and just say, forget all of it, it's just GPT-5 now. Don't worry about choosing the model. We'll just route it for you. Seems like it was kind of necessary, and framing it as GPT-5 makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think there was some sense of people being underwhelmed, at least in the Twitter AI space. Sam Altman, as per usual, was hyping it up quite a bit, posted like a Death Star image. The reactions I'm seeing today is, people are like, okay, this is a good model. It's an improvement in some ways. It's not a gigantic leap forward. Basically, everyone agrees on that. And so, there's kind of a mix of some people saying this is a great model. It just gets things done, which it seems to be the case. It's like, if you want to use a model, GPT-5 might be the best for a lot of stuff, but it's not some kind of giant leap forward that you could have guessed it would be based on the bump from GPT-4 to GPT-5.
Absolutely. And I think one of the metrics that really tells the story here, again, I do think, by the way, the meter evals piece is a legitimate thing. And Meter will be the first to say this, all these things are flawed in various ways, but it is the single best thing we have as far as like, or let's say one of the critical tools we have to evaluate human-like task completion for AI R&D. Another, though, is this idea of SWE-bench verified, which SWE-bench was originally, I think, an open source thing somebody put out. The SWE-bench verified is something that OpenAI cleaned up. And on that, so interestingly, Claude Opus 4.1 hit 74.5%. We'll talk about that later, but GPT-5 hit 74.9, which, where I come from is just called within noise. And there's a bunch of ancillary kind of related evals that have been run by some labs. I'm just seeing right now on Twitter, somebody from Princeton just posting their own eval on Swebench or Swebench verified. And it looks like, in that case, Opus 4 ahead of GPT-5. So like they're kind of neck and neck, back and forth. The price difference is going to make a big impact for sure. But sort of interesting, as you say, like the Death Star, did it really materialize? I think right now, as the dust starts to settle, we'll see more. But the vibe check does seem to be like, as you say, solid model. Is it a Death Star? Maybe not. And interesting question for further kind of the future of scaling, if you will. The narrow capabilities that matter, I will say, are AI R&D for the kind of super intelligence trajectory stuff. That's where the meter evals look interesting, but hard to know. We'll have to wait to see where the dust settles.
One last thing I'll mention is there's been like a whole bunch of updates to the usage profile of this. One of them is what you can do with a free account on ChatGPT. Now you can send up to 10 messages every 5 hours, and a free tier user has one GPT-5 thinking message per day. If you pay for the $20 per month plan, ChatGPT Plus, you can send up to 80 messages every 3 hours, and then chats will automatically switch to a mini version until the limit resets. I don't know exactly how this compares to before, but it seems lower, and I do wonder if having reached 700 million users per month or whatever it is, OpenAI is trying to start burning less money with the free usage they allow people to have, because literally every free query is money being burned, right? Well, gonna move on now. Let's talk about Opus 4.1 from Anthropic. So this happened just a couple of days before GPT-5. They released this update, and as you might imagine, going from Opus 4 to Opus 4.1, a bit less fanfare. What we saw was, a decent improvement on some benchmarks, but not a giant improvement. In fact, some people were having a laugh at the marketing by Anthropic because the leading chart was like 2 bars, the previous one, and the highest one, 72% to 74%. And you could barely see that little jump of 2% because your y-axis was, pretty large.
Oh, we didn't talk about this on the OpenAI thing, the chart crime piece. Sorry.
Yeah, we could get into it. Well, let's get into it for a little while. This was more of a funny detail. I don't think it's very impactful. But if you were tuning into a live stream, which, by the way, I tuned in early, there were 60,000 people watching this live stream at the beginning. During the presentation, there were some demos, there were some charts. A couple of the charts people noticed had some very questionable design decisions. For instance, there were at least one where, OpenAI GPT-5 marked in pink was, of course, the highest bar. The value itself wasn't the highest. There was another bar that should have been higher. And there were actually a couple instances where it seemed like either an honest mistake or just, as you say, a chart crime.
By the way, I don't mean to imply intentionality behind the chart crime thing. To be clear, I think it's so obviously stupid for a lab to do that intentionally, because obviously people are going to see that and they're going to jump on it. I think this was just an honest mistake, but I think it happened on multiple plots. I don't you're right, it was at least one, but I seem to remember a couple where it's just what's going on? Did the marketing team start with okay, this is what the bars have to look like, and that the evals guys were like, here are the numbers. Okay, just slap them on. Is that what happened? Because that anyway.
Yeah, I think what people saw is the charts seemed accurate on the blog post, so it was probably more of a presentation thing. And yeah, it's pretty funny. There was
some interns having a bad week.
Amusement on that front. So to bring it back to Opus 4.1, it was kind of the opposite. The folks on Twitter had some fun being like, the marketing team at Anthropic should get the opposite of a raise or something like that. But big picture story, right? We're going from Opus 4 to 4.1. It's a minor version bump, and kind of corresponding to that, slightly better at coding, slightly better at tool use, at multi-file code refactoring, real-world software engineering tasks. That's kind of about it. It's not a huge deal, obviously, but it still is a decent improvement. Pricing here doesn't change or anything.
Yeah, it's all, I mean, I guess the way to think about Opus 4.1 is it's like solidly beats O3, and then it's like competitive with GPT-5. I think you just have to try both on your task and see which one works best. I don't think it's obvious at this point.
Yeah. GPT-5, by the way, also still using AM dashes, which is another thing people on Twitter love to make jokes on. If you don't know, for some reason, ChatGPT just loves to use AM dashes. And in fact, that makes it very easy to spot when there's
Yeah.
output. If there's bolding and if there's a lot of dashes, right, it's definitely a chatbot output instead of a human written thing. Well, we got OpenAI and Anthropic so far. Let's go on to Google. Actually, about a week ago now, Google rolled out Gemini Deep Think AI, which actually might be the biggest deal of all by some metrics at least. So if you're a subscriber to their $250 per month Ultra subscription, you are now able to start using this DeepThink model, which is kind of the most advanced reasoning model you can get. This is the equivalent to something like O1 or Super Grok Heavy. This is where you throw a ton of compute at a problem. This, they say, is the model that let them achieve an IMO win that we discussed previously. Also achieves state-of-the-art performance on humanities last exam. We are at 34% on humanities last exam. So, getting up there soon enough, this exam will be beat, seems. Yeah, all around, very impressive performance. I think interesting to see this 200, 250, 300 dollars per month becoming more regular, and this kind of paradigm of seemingly just test time scaling to the max, probably running multiple instances of the models in parallel and comparing and combining their outputs. We know Super Grok Heavy does that. From the little we know of how the IMO accomplishment happened with this model, it seems like that's also the case here.
Yeah, pretty remarkable, and also pretty remarkable how consistent the progress has been across the different teams. Like, back in the day of GPT-3, it seemed like OpenAI had this insurmountable 18-month lead or whatever on all the other labs, and now very much not the case. It's an interesting challenge economically, a race to the bottom on pricing, a lot of competition, whether it be Grok, ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini. Like it's really unclear which model is best for your task right now. And that's a really challenging position for these labs to be in, because the margin that you can then charge is a lot more limited, right? So I think this is going to be one of the big questions as we eye the $100 billion, $500 billion infrastructure buildouts for these big data centers. How long can that be sustained when you have not a single, but 3 or even 4 frontier labs? We'll see what Meta does as well. But like this is a structural challenge now for the frontier AI sort of research world, and open source as well. We'll talk about that later, but it's sort of like cannibalizing a lot of this too. So yeah, we'll have to see where things go, but it's definitely a multi-horse race.
Mm-hmm. And we've got just one more story in this app section. We've spent quite a while covering the big news. So on to Grok, another one of the big players. On that front, no new LLMs. What did roll out is Grok Imagine, which is the image and video generator on the platform. Previously, there was integration with Flux. Now there's this update that you can access to if you're Super Grok or Premium Plus X subscriber. Kind of the thing that got the headlines, and the headline we are covering here is Grok Imagine, XAI's new AI image and video generator, lets you make not safe for work content. There is a spicy mode in there that At least, I don't know if this has been removed or what, but lets you make porn basically with very few restrictions. There was another article on someone entering a prompt related to Taylor Swift. There was a history of Taylor Swift and generative content. First of all, they easily generated media of Taylor Swift. And then if you turned on the spicy version, it showed Taylor Swift doing some inappropriate things. So Grok going full on uncensored as usual, I suppose, and very much against the grain of these other text to image providers from Google and so on that definitely do not allow you to generate not safe for work content. Yeah, it is what it is. It's kind of crazy if you actually look at examples of what this generates.
Yeah, the legal implications of this will be very interesting, especially when you get into, I mean, it's bad enough or complex enough, shall we say, with celebrities. But you imagine, non-famous people who, just you find AI generated pornography of yourself just because you have a couple of photos online or whatever. That's seemingly the world that you're trending towards with this sort of thing. So where you draw that line is really interesting. Where you think of the limits of free speech and how that intersects with the right of individuals not to have pornographic imagery of themselves made. Is there such a right? Man, that's, yeah, what an interesting decade we live in. Let's put it that way.
And moving on from all the product updates, let's go on to applications and business with some business updates. First up, Meta and Microsoft stocks have risen on strong earnings reports and on their AI spending. So this happened, I believe, previous week. Shares of Meta rose by 11%, Microsoft by 4%. Both announced better than expected earnings, and both are continuing to invest in AI infrastructure. So Meta revised its capital expenditure forecast to the year to between 66 and 72 billion, up from 64 billion before. Capital expenditures meaning like how much we expect to pay for stuff, basically, the stuff in question being mostly data centers and GPUs. Microsoft is estimating over 30 billion in capital expenditures and some other details. So the gist of it is investors still are seeming to be on board with giant investments in AI. So with Mark Zuckerberg's recent, flurry of hirings and then basically promises of going all in on super intelligence, it seems to be paying off in terms of the sentiment with regards to Meta.
Yeah. And the nature of the super intelligence race is that the expectation value is sort of reflects a lot of the value. The vast majority of the value is in the future when you hit super intelligence, if you're the first lab to do it. Right. So that's what is behind a lot of this. It's not independent of current revenues, but it is a distinct incentive to invest in this stuff that besides current revenues, which are also strong. So yeah, no huge surprise there overall. It's also the case that we're seeing, these massive clusters go up in more energy rich areas like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, for at least inference runs, we're told. The amount of money that is being spent when you're talking about the 1 gigawatt, let alone the 5 gigawatt range, is pretty insane. Satya Nadella, I think, famously said in that Davos interview, he's like, I'm good for my 80 billion a year of infrastructure investment. This was a reference to how sort of Stargate seemed to be moving a little bit more aggressively on the spending side than Microsoft wanted, which was kind of part of that rift between OpenAI and Microsoft. And it seems like far from 80 billion, he's now looking at like 120 billion of annualized spend on infrastructure. That's actually gone up, if anything, since then, which is pretty interesting.
And speaking of Stargate, the next story is about OpenAI planning to establish Stargate Norway with a 230 megawatt data center. So they are agreeing to be an anchor customer for this new data center, apparently working with Nscale Global Holdings Ltd, a data center company that is going to actually build the facility with some other investors and OpenAI being a customer. So I guess a big deal in the sense that there's not been too much investment in Europe geographically for these kinds of data centers. It's mostly been the Middle East or the US. And another indication of how far OpenAI is willing to go with their Stargate endeavors.
Yeah, and we were just talking about sort of like 1 gigawatt level as being, the sort of the touchstone for certainly late 2026, early 2027 is when you'll start to see those gigawatt clusters really ramp up and power actual training runs. So the Stargate Norway site is going to be 230 megawatts of capacity. They say with ambitions to expand by an additional 290 megawatts. So you're looking at over half a gig once this is all online. And they're looking at 100,000. They say Nvidia GPUs. Okay, they probably mean at this point, let me see, 2026. They may mean Rubens actually at that point, possibly Blackwells and Rubens. But anyways, this is a very, very large scale thing. Norway is a cold country, so that helps. But a big focus here is going to be the renewable tie-in. And I think that's part of the cost of doing business in Europe, at least, is all the focus on renewables. So it will run entirely, they say, on renewable power, and it's expected to incorporate closed loop direct-to-chip liquid cooling. Okay, so closed loop meaning very roughly, you can imagine you pump like a liquid into your chips to take the heat away from them, because that's a big problem for cooling. The liquid gets heated up, and then there's a pump that guides that liquid back out. And then one thing you could do is just like create a fine mist, a fine spray of that liquid to cause it to cool down, and then have it collect and then kind of pump it back in. They're not doing that. They're keeping this closed loop. So basically not losing any of that liquid to evaporation or anything else, and just sort of like keeping the circuit closed. That's all that means. Direct to chip liquid cooling is an absolute must at this point. It's just for 2026, the amount of heat that's being put off by these chips is just so insane that air cooling doesn't allow you to do the kind of cooling that you need. So that's the context there. It seems like a really big project. And as you said, like all these projects have like a big funder, a data center builder, sometimes a data center operator that all kind of come together to form joint ventures along with, Stargate or OpenAI or whatever. And they're doing that here. No surprise.
Next up, going back to Anthropic, we have a new estimate of their revenue. The news is that revenue is nearing 5 billion in annualized income. And it seems that Anthropic is trying to raise another round. So they are seemingly raising as much as $5 billion at 170 billion valuation. And I think this is kind of an interesting trend in all these AI companies, OpenAI especially, but now also Anthropic, in just continuously trying to ingest money. Like, this is not usually how startup works. Usually there's like a major round, Series A, Series B, then you work for a while, maybe a year later or a couple months later, you get your next round, usually a year or two later. With AI, it's different. With AI, everything is turbocharged. The difference between rounds is several months. And in the case of Anthropic and OpenAI, is just perpetual fundraising, very different from the norm.
Yeah, and this is where already these companies are sort of, I don't say scraping the bottom of the barrel, but they're looking for the last sources of highly liquid cash that can handle the scale of fundraise that they need, right? You're looking for like, how do we raise, like $30 billion? How do we raise, like an Airbnb like worth of of company or a Dropbox or whatever, right? Like that's what they're talking about. To do that, you're looking at sovereign wealth funds. There's aren't that many other places that you can turn to. And then the question is going to be, well, after that, where do we go, right? And there's no real answer to that question as far as I know, apart from governments, like actual governments just coming in and giving, like $100 billion, which, yeah, hey, it could happen, but it's a pretty wild world we live in. This article is actually quite interesting. It follows a report from Menlo Ventures that sort of laid out the competitive landscape on the enterprise side, the coding side, a couple other aspects of the market. This is interesting. So Anthropic apparently now holds 32% of the enterprise LLM market by usage. OpenAI is now in second place with 25%. This is a reversal. So in 2023, which, 2 years ago, I held 50% of the enterprise market share. and Anthropic had 12. So Anthropic's effectively reversed that in just 2 years, which is pretty remarkable. Google's also seen an increase in usage, but they're in third place here. Anthropic, by the way, does even better when it comes to coding. 42% of the enterprise market share, 21% for OpenAI. So quite interesting. Like Anthropic seems to have come out of nowhere with products that do great at the enterprise level. This is an incredible sales achievement, among other things. Like obviously the models have to be good enough to do this, but it does make you think about why then OpenAI chose this moment to release their open source models, right? What do open source models do for enterprise customers? Well, you can run them on premises, which is something that a lot of enterprise customers want. If OpenAI is kind of like, I don't know if they're seeing the writing on the wall or if they're just like, hey, you know what? We're not doing as well on the enterprise side. What we can really, like, we know consumers want a deployed app, like everything done for them. So they'll come to chatgpt.com, like no problem. And we're leading there. But what do enterprises want? They have the infrastructure potentially to serve their own models. So they like open source models. And so far they've had to turn to like Chinese models basically, or sort of lagging meta models or Mistral models that are just behind. And so, this is an interesting way to potentially kneecap the competition. Anyway, this report sort of provides a little bit of context for why perhaps that open source model drop happened.
Yeah, interesting report, kind of confirming that Anthropic's strategy basically has worked from the very beginning in terms of business. The focus of Anthropic has been the enterprise customer. If you compare OpenAI and Anthropic, on Anthropic, you can't generate images, you can't talk to it, there's no advanced voice mode, there's no video generation. It's just kind of a chatbot with some basic image understanding. And the focus is definitely more than anything kind of real world software engineering tasks. If you look also at the spend of the enterprise, it was apparently $3.5 billion in 2024. By mid 2025, that's going up to $8.4 billion. So no surprise there. You can make a lot of money by dominating the enterprise market. Businesses are willing to spend the big bucks to get the best of the best. So yeah, kind of pretty impressive, as you said, that Anthropic was able to take the lead there. And we just covered how Anthropic is nearing $5 billion in annualized revenue. OpenAI, in comparison, is apparently nearing $12 billion in annualized revenue. So this is doubling its revenue from the beginning of 2025. And also, I believe, almost doubling the active users. So seemingly they're getting 700 million weekly active users across both the consumer and enterprise products. So, wow, right? Like, who doesn't know about ChatGPT at this point? Like, ChatGPT is becoming the Google of LLMs.
Which
And
increasingly is the Google of Google.
yes, well, I think the Google of Google is still Google.
That is true.
It's really something that OpenAI, I think, in terms of brand knowledge, in terms of, I think, consumer usage, still seems to be kind of a default. And as a result, this company is making over $10 billion a year and are still nowhere near profitable and are still looking for more money. So similar to Anthropic, OpenAI is still raising money. It turns out they have successfully raised $8.3 billion in a new funding round at a valuation of $300 billion. And this is part of their attempt to get a total of $40 billion in total funding by the end of a year, including investments from SoftBank. So OpenAI is still really pushing on the fundraising front and still succeeding in a very, very aggressive kind of rise in usage and growth.
Yeah, Blackstone, by the way, is joining the cap table as part of that. A bunch of sort of carry-on investors who are participating as well. Fidelity Management, founder. Okay, so this is like, if you want to know the who's who of like who the best investors in the Valley are, this is a pretty good way to just like, yeah, let's see who participated in this round, right? So Founders Fund, which is Peter Thiel, Sequoia Capital, Andreessen Horowitz, And then there's a bunch of like kind of other investors that are like kind of not, they're amazing, but they're not like S tier, that are on the cap table as well. So there's pretty like they're pulling together everything they can from your traditional VCs. And then we're also seeing obviously SoftBank play, which is a really footing the lion's share of the bill here with like 30 billion or so already committed.
And just one more story in the business front. We've talked about nothing but the big players so far. So let's cover one kind of up and coming player. We have a startup called Noma Security. They've raised $100 million in a Series B round. Their pitch is they're focused on cybersecurity, on AI, and agent security. And this is bringing the total funding of the company to 132 million in under 2 years, having been founded in 2023. So personally, I just think it's interesting timing and interesting that they're able to get this much money. Recently, ChatGPT also launched their Asian mode. And I do think, as we've discussed previously, there are a lot of potential vulnerabilities when you let agents surf the web and do stuff for you. And there's definitely space there for new cybersecurity players.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at this article has a bunch of references for some reason to like Israeli companies, just like in the page that I'm looking at. So,
incidentally, Israel actually is a leader in the cybersecurity tech
exactly.
space.
Yeah. So that's why I was trying to figure out, are they an Israeli company? Because that would make all the sense in the world, right? So, yeah. Okay, I'm guessing Nivbron and Alantron. So yeah, most likely. Oh yeah, there you go. So okay, sorry. Founded in 2023 by CEO Nibron and CTO Alantron, who met in the IDF's unit 8200, right? So unit 8200 is this intelligence unit basically for the IDF. So and then they say the company came out of stealth in October 2024, and when they say stealth, they mean stealth. Anyway, so that's kind of interesting. Yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. You see a lot of great cyber companies come out of Israel because they are so good at this. You know, think about who did the Stuxnet thing. I want them doing my cybersecurity. That's kind of where that comes from.
And now on to projects and open source. The other really major story of this past week, OpenAI releasing their first open weight models since 2019. Long promised and now delivered. They have released GPT OSS 120B and GPT OSS 20B. So two variants of the models on a kind of lower-ish size scale, license permissively Apache 2.0. So actually different from Llama, different from most open source models. No special kind of fine print on the usage allowed here. Generally seems decent from what I've seen on the reactions to these models. They're quite good, except that they are definitely super what people on Reddit are saying now, safety maxed. So this is very likely to refuse a request that even borderline might be doing something inappropriate. And I do wonder if part of the reason for the delay for the release from earlier this summer for OpenAI was just optimizing the hell out of the alignment piece and the safety piece of these models to prevent anything embarrassing from happening.
Yeah, well, and one of the things they do emphasize in the release is this understanding that when you put something out in open source, people can fine tune it. And so the suite of evals that they ran, they've got a whole separate paper where they talk about the evaluations that they ran and their sort of philosophy on open source model releases and the safety and national security implications. Something that we called for, I think, like two and a half years ago or something, when we put out that report, the first one. You can't consider your eval work complete for an open source model unless you've tried to fine tune it for weaponizable capabilities, because your adversaries will do that, right? They'll take the base model and they will fine tune it. And so it's not enough to just look at the model and say, well, it can't help you design bioweapons in and of itself, so everything's fine, right? The question is, sure, but if I specifically train it with data that I would expect adversaries to have, whether they're non-state actors or nation state actors. What is the risk profile? So these models are text only, by the way. They are explicitly designed to be used within agentic workflows. So instruction following is a big focus, web search, Python code execution, that sort of thing. They've got the ability to provide full chain of thought, obviously. So this is an interesting thing, right? Because OpenAI's kind of proprietary models don't allow you to see the full chain of thought. They give you an edited version, but not the full thing. So this is one context where you actually can see that because it is open source. Architecture-wise, we know it's an MOE model, obviously, because we had the model itself. They say it's built upon the GPT-2 and GPT-3 architecture. Unclear if that means it is not built upon the GPT-4 architecture. Interesting, right? That was not included in that list. So maybe a slight hint that GPT-4 is a different beast, and we're not actually getting a sense of necessarily the architectural elements that make GPT-4 tick in this release, but still quite interesting. 2 different versions, I think, as you mentioned, a 120 billion parameter and a 20 billion parameter version. These are MOE models, so they're experts, of course. 128 experts in the 120 billion parameter version, 36 experts in the 20 billion parameter version. And in both cases, you're using the top 4. So in any given token, any given inference run, only 4 out of those 36 or 128 experts are actually activated. And anyway, they go through a couple of different sort of decisions that they made on the algorithmic side. They use banded window attention in alternate layers. So what this basically means is it's kind of like a narrowed context window where each token only gets to attend to like the, say, 128 closest tokens to it. And this happens every other layer. So they alternate it with dense attention that gives you kind of a wider aperture to make sure that there is global information flowing through the pipes as well. But this kind of helps you balance just like the compute heaviness of having a full attention mechanism with the need to have that global information processing. So group query attention, so nothing surprising there. I think you can check out, the DeepSeek. No, well, they did a variant of it. Anyway, you can check out our previous podcast on GQA. And we don't know that much about the training data, by the way. We train the model, they say, on a text-only data set with trillions of tokens. Okay, like if there is a phrase that could give you less information about the quantity of data used here, of course it's in the trillions of tokens, right? That's just the cost of doing business when you're making frontier models or anything like this. The question is, how many trillions? Where specifically did it come from? They say, well, with a focus on STEM, coding, and general knowledge. So kind of interesting that we don't know the specific number of tokens. Not sure why, if that's particularly sensitive. Last piece I'll just mention is on the compute side. So they did this with 2.1 million H100 hours. And so by my back of envelope math, depending on the precision that they used for training, and if you assume like 50% utilization, something like that, you're looking at around 10 to the 25 flops. So it's, not a not a true frontier amount of flops, but it's a really that's a highly scaled training run, about an order of magnitude shy of what you see with like a Grok 4, for example. Yeah, to give you a sense. So pretty cool. They use deliberative alignment. Again, you can check out our podcast on deliberative alignment. When we first covered it, this is like OpenAI's, in a sense, their answer to constitutional AI. And they do say these models are a lot more vulnerable to prompt injection attacks than OpenAI's proprietary models. It's actually pretty wild. Prompt injection hijacking for these models is like 22% attack success rate for the 120 billion parameter version, whereas for many is like 8%. So it's worth flagging that is a vulnerability with this model.
Just a couple more notes to add to that. So on the MOE front, the 128 billion parameter model has a total of 128 total experts. That means that although having many, like 6 times the number of weights compared to the 20 billion, it only has 5.1 billion active parameters per token. The 20 billion parameter model has just a fourth of the total experts, so it has 3.6 billion active parameters. What that means is these models are runnable on a single GPU if you have the most expensive GPU around. If you have an H100, due to those experts and due to doing quantization that's pretty aggressive, you can use this on arguably kind of consumer hardware if you're a consumer with a lot of money. So yeah, on the whole, a pretty useful model. I think there is a question mark as to whether this would be your model of choice at this point, or if you would go with Kimi K2 or DeepSeek for, your fine tuning or model usage needs. To me, still unclear how those options stack up. Probably on the model size range where this is at, which is only like medium scale size, right? Like Kimi K2, we saw over 1 trillion parameters with many experts, I think something like 32 billion active parameters at a time. So as you might expect, these models are pretty good on benchmarks. They are, capable models, but not kind of the cutting edge of what you can get with open source models right now.
Yeah, I think the way to think of this is, or one way to think of it is, it's like an option for Western companies that don't want to be running Chinese open source models. So they have something that's not made in China. It's a pretty big deal if you're in open source, especially for agentic models, because you don't know what behaviors have been trained in, especially now that the CCP is paying really close attention to this. But yeah, one other thing too, by the way, sorry, actually, two quick things. One of which is they do say that they have explicitly not put optimization pressure on the chain of thought for either of these open source models. So there was a open letter or open paper, you can think of it as, that came out a couple weeks ago where all the big luminaries in the space were saying, guys, can we please not train the chain of thought to look nice and pretty? Because we want to know if our model is scheming or thinking of evil things. And if we just sort of like try to safety wash it and make the ugly stuff go away, the model will just learn to think those thoughts anyway, but just conceal them from us. And so this is OpenAI saying, hey, we're going to walk the walk on this and explicitly flag in this paper. It's an important bit of signaling that they're doing to the ecosystem. We are not going to put optimization pressure on the chain of thought to make it look pretty for that reason. Last comment here is on quantization. You mentioned that quantization was a big part of it. Mixed floating point 4 format is what they are using for this. That's what allowed them to compress the model down to the point where the smaller one fits on one GPU. 4.25 bits per parameter is the number. Basically, this means 4 bits per parameter. And then there's like you have like a block of parameters that have a one scaling factor that you use to get the rough order of magnitude right. And then your 4 bits do the rest. But yeah, so essentially an impressive model that fits right into the ecosystem. They are open sourcing also a framework called the Harmony Tokenizer that I do expect we'll be seeing more of. When you make an agentic model, you need new kinds of sort of model self-reference abilities to refer to different kinds of workflow. Instead of just like the model and the user talking to each other, there's like times when the model needs to think. There's times when the model needs to use certain tools. And so they have a tokenizer that explicitly accounts for that, and they are open sourcing that as well. So anyway, this is a whole bunch of shit that is dropped at the same time in this paper, and could go on for hours, and certainly OpenAI would.
Yeah, a whole bunch of details. Last thing to mention, as you said, train from the get-go to be capable of reasoning. You can specify reasoning low, medium, high in the prompt, and it's, I guess, explicitly optimized to be able to adjust those reasoning amounts. Also trained to support tool use out of the box, and it comes with several tools like web search and Python execution. So yeah, all around, you can do a lot of this open source model. Onto a slightly more out there open source release, we've got Falcon H1, a family of hybrid head language models redefining efficiency and performance. So this is a hybrid architecture in the sense of combining transformer-based attention with state space models, which we've covered a decent amount over years. I think definitely there was a time when state space models were of the rage. Quick recap, state space models are a recurrent alternative to transformers. So you do a sort of loop and can theoretically keep going for as many inputs as you want, as opposed to transformers, which get all the input all at once and kind of get a big chunk of it, and that's all they can do. You can't sort of keep feeding it data recursively. So it's been known for some time that It seems to be the case that going all in on the current state space just doesn't work as well as going on a hybrid architecture like you do here. So this family of models, there's a whole bunch of variants with 0.5 billion, 1.5 billion, 3 billion, 7 billion, and 34 billion parameters. Giant paper, 70 pages, which we're not going to be able to go through. Bottom line, the 34 billion parameter model is decent. They don't seem to be competing too much on performance if you compare it to Qwen 332B, Llama 3.370B, Llama 4 Scout. It has some decent eval results, but generally not state of the art. So
yeah, which is what we see, right? With a lot of these kind of like Mamba state-based model type things, right? They make a good proof of concept along some axes, and then we just haven't seen them become like a go-to production grade model. What is interesting here is the scale. So it is cool that we're seeing Mamba get used at the 30 billion plus parameter level. That's cool. I agree. It seems so far more on the, I don't call it academic side, but it's interesting that they're pushing this direction. If Mamba ends up being useful, then they'll have a good lead. And this is what they have to do, right? So this is the Falcon series comes out of TII, so the Technology Innovation Institute in the UAE, and they're playing catch up. So they need a strategy that allows them to kind of leapfrog. So I would imagine that's a big part of the reason why they're investing in Mamba. It's like kind of a good way to learn both the traditional transformer engineering stuff that you need to just kind of try to catch up, I guess, and also to place a bet on maybe we leapfrog because we understand how to scale Mamba better than other state-based models better than other labs. That's my rough guess there.
Yeah, and as with some of the other open source releases, a very detailed report, I guess 53 pages, not counting the appendix, going into various details, including quite a bit of detail on the training data and some conclusions. So you do get faster inference. They say up to 8 times faster inference in long context scenarios, and you're able to get better performance while using less training data. So it's more the efficiency piece, as per the title of the report. It also seems to be the case that you get more of a gain at lower scales. So the 1.5 deep models is competitive with 7 to 10 billion parameter models. Seems to be, and that's one of the big questions, is if you try to scale up the state space kind of hybrid option to the scale of what Anthropic and ChatGPT are based on, is that going to be better? Well, this is not clearly indicating either way, but isn't showing that, you get an easy advantage, so to speak. On to the next story, we've got Meta Clip 2, a worldwide scaling recipe. So this is about contrastive language image pre-training, CLIP, which is a classic, so to speak. I think going back to 2022, you are able to input some text and some image and see kind of how they compare, more or less, the similarity match. And this is both a model and a bit of a research paper. So pair the title, A Worldwide Scaling Recipe. What that's talking about is, can you train on all the languages all at once? What they say is, if you try to train at a smaller scale, you actually get this curse of multilinguality. So you actually do worse if you train on both English and non-English data. As you scale, you are, so to speak, breaking the curse. So you're able to do better by utilizing all, worldwide data, right? All the languages without having to translate to English. And that's what they call this Meta Clip 2 recipe.
Yeah, I am pretty surprised this paper makes no reference to the idea of like positive transfer and negative transfer. It reads to me as like they're trying to coin a phrase really hard, this idea of the curse of multilinguality, but we already have a term for what this is. This is just positive transfer, right? So famously, when you like at small scale train a model on, say, 3 different tasks, you add another task, and what you'll find is the model's performance on the first 3 tasks will drop. And the reason is the model's kind of like overloaded. It's just like this, now it's got another thing to handle, and it's like, crap. But if you do this at really, really high scales, what you find, and with many different modalities, what you find eventually is that the model actually, when you give it a new task, its performance on the others will go up. And the reason for that is that it's able to take the lessons that it's learned from that new task and apply them to the others. Sort of like in the same way that I guess if you, let me think, well, like, I don't know, martial arts or something, right? Let's say like you did Muay Thai and you did Greco-Roman wrestling, you're probably going to be better at picking up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu just because you know how your body moves. You may have picked up a couple things about controlling someone's upper body from Muay Thai, like doing clinches, and then for wrestling, like, kind of keeping them pinned, whatever. That's kind of the idea of what's happening here. You're just seeing it play out in languages. Like, what is speaking another language, but just another task that you have to learn to perform? That's just what this is. I hate to make it sound reductive, but sometimes, like, I think it kind of muddies the water more, because if you actually didn't call this something other than that, it would invite you more to look at comparisons with, like, how does this work with non-language new tasks? And that's actually almost like it's not a missing plot here, but it would be really interesting to see at least a little discussion of how this contrasts, because speaking different languages is more similar in task space than, going from classifying images to controlling a robotic arm, but they're on a spectrum. And it would be really interesting to kind of see that explored a bit. Still a really cool paper, and awesome that this was done. More validation for the idea that scale just automatically gives you a positive transfer over time. But yeah, this is sort of like a little nitpick at my end.
And one last open source story, BFL and Krea release FLUX.1 Krea, an open image model designed for realism. So we've talked about Flux before. This is basically the best text-to-image model out there, both open sourced and not. And the big deal here is this is building upon the existing open source Flux variant, with a focus on making it so the AI-generated images don't look like AI-generated images. It remains to be the case that often you're able to spot AI images just based on them having a certain aesthetic, which is kind of hard to pin down, but it's something to do with a softness, blurriness, a smoothness of the image. It is like surprisingly global. So Krea has a quite long blog post discussing the topic, talking about how they train it for the images looking like real photographs and not clearly AI outputs. And I think worth noting, because yeah, you might assume you can spot an AI generated image still just based on these aesthetic trends. Don't assume that to be the case for too long. On to research and advancements. First story, Google's newest AI model acts like a satellite to track climate change. We've got another alpha model from Google. This one is Alpha Earth Foundations. It is designed to track analyze changes on Earth using, satellite data. So a bunch of cameras floating up in space looking down at Earth. And now with this model, users can access detailed information about any location on Earth. So you can use this to get at various things. You can get color-coded map that highlight material properties, vegetation, groundwater, human constructions. That lets you understand ecosystem dynamics, air quality, sunlight, etc. And overall, this model is intended to assist governments and corporations in deciding what to do based on understanding of geography and climate and things like that.
Yeah, it seems like a big part of it is just the compression that they apply to the like terabytes of data that exist about Earth's surface, and just like getting those wrangled down to a manageable scale. So it seems like they're overlaying a lot of essentially different images of the Earth, about vegetation, about mineral content, about all the things. I'm not a geologist, but like, all the things that might be relevant to geography and, research on climate and things like that. So yeah, I mean, there's like limited information about how this is done in the article itself, more than the artifact itself that you get. It does seem pretty cool. In the flurry of things this week, haven't had the chance to look at the actual paper, so this is maybe one to bookmark.
Yeah, we probably don't have the capacity to go into full detail, but as you said, the gist of it is they're compressing a whole bunch of data, and the challenge there, right, is you get a ton of observations over time from different sensors. You get noise, you get clouds moving in, and whatever. So the model just takes all of that and makes it usable more easily. And the next one, also a story from Google. They have released Genie 3, an AI model capable of generating 3D environments in real time for user and AI agent interaction. We've discussed and covered the precursors to this with Genie 2 and other ones. This is another instance of a video generation model with real-time responsiveness to inputs. So essentially, you can be an active agent within an AI-generated world. Some examples of this could be, being a human character in a city environment like you would in GTA, but this is entirely spit out by a neural network. There's no sort of like game code or anything like that, no 3D models. It's all being rendered. And this one is kind of a big deal if you look at example videos.
It's
The
crazy.
extent to which they are able to be consistent over time, the extent to which like the world doesn't distort as you move around or look around, but instead stays consistent, is unprecedented. It's actually quite impressive, the jump from previous models of the sort to Genie 3. We don't know much about it. They didn't release any sort of research. It's really just a showing off kind of release. It's also not usable via demo or anything like that. But yeah, surprising to me the extent to which this real-time interactive model is a leap beyond what we've seen before.
Yeah, so we covered Genie, so it stands for Generative Interactive Environments, back in, I just went back to look it up before the podcast. I think it was in February of 2024. So I recommend checking that out for a breakdown of the architecture, or the likely sort of, at least the core of this architecture. It's sort of interesting how they bake in this like latent action model that allows them to train in basically control, like keyboard controls, basically. So you can, move forward, move back, move to the side, accelerate, whatever. There's like a limited number of actions that you can take in these videos to sort of like, generate new frames based on your actions. It's pretty nuts. And some of the examples too, like you'll see, depending on how you prompt it, like there was one of like someone riding a bicycle in a mountain in India. And you could sort of see how if you moved your head around, you would like see the person's arms, or your arms, I guess. It sort of extrapolated the body and the mechanics of what's happening around. Persistence is a really big deal here, right? So when Genie first launched, they had coherence times where, so you can imagine, like one example they show is they paint like a blue line on a wall, and then they turn away from the wall for a couple of seconds, and then they turn back and the blue line is still there, right? So that persistence, that coherence from frame to frame over long horizons now is on the order of minutes. So the model will remember that happened. By contrast, in the old case, it was, seconds, right? So you quickly imagine how that makes reality sort of disintegrate fairly quickly. In this case, you actually have these long coherence time interactions. This is really important because it sets up a really effective environments for training agents, right? The big issue with training agents is that you need, at least in the real world, is like the real world takes a lot of time. It's slow. Everything is robotic. If you move into more like digital settings, then having a procedural generation of new environments is really tricky, especially with realistic environments. This gives you a way to do that, not for free because it costs compute, but it gives you a way to generate sort of artificially and digitally these environments really quickly. So you can imagine this being useful for training agents quickly. The other dimension, although you do have a limited action space, so you can, maybe have, I guess in the old version, it was 8 different actions that you could take that they were training the model to infer. Here, you still have a limited action space, but you also can prompt the model in real time to change the environment. They call this promptable world events. So you could like prompt in, make an alien spacecraft land in front of me, right? And like now you interact with it. So it gives you another way to interact beyond the kind of activation space strategy, but they're not yet simulating other agents in the environment. they're struggling with creating clear and legible text in context other than in the text box that you feed in. So unless you explicitly write the text in your prompt, the text that you see in the video that's generated will tend to be kind of garbled and weird. Anyway, so that's it. It's a wild step and visually absolutely stunning. And this is certainly something that Google has been working on for a long time. Big advantage to them is that they own YouTube, right? So they're actually able to train on that with no issues. Other labs can't. And if it turns out that this kind of environment generation is critical for training agents, that is a really interesting structural advantage for Google in the kind of AGI race.
Yeah, and another advantage is, as you said, DeepMind has been working on this for a long time, setting up like trainable environments with actual literal video games. They've published research on this. Wouldn't be surprised if that combined with YouTube is what made this possible. And yet, on the note of realism, they are doing 720p, so like 70 HD, quite sharp, at 24 frames per second. So compared to Genie 2, that was, pretty blurry, pretty obviously AI. This looks good. Like,
yeah,
the videos look good. So very impressive. Still limited in the sense of how much physics we see. So if you try to see like object collisions, there's not a ton of that. But it's getting to a point where you could definitely see yourself having fun playing with these kinds of things. And next up, we've got a paper, AlphaGo moment for model architecture discovery. So the AlphaGo moment here, they make a bit of a major claim in this paper. So model architecture discovery is a pretty well-studied topic. Basically, usually we have just manually chosen how to build the neural networks, how many layers to use, what kind of functions to build with, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, you might consider just directly optimizing the architecture, doing a search over the space of possible neural network architectures to discover what is ideal. And there's been, quite a bit of work in the field, but so far, at least, it seems that there's not been any sort of revolution as a result. This paper claims to introduce a system that leads to a real kind of breakthrough in model architecture. So they term this their move 37 in model design, in the sense that you get a novel discovery that is a real game changer. They get this stream-aware router that introduces the query and summary router that leads to reducing compute while preserving some stuff. I won't get into too much of the details of the discovery, but this came about because of this ASI Arch framework, where they have this essentially automated researcher. It's similar in some ways to what we've seen before with AI research systems.
Like Sakana type stuff, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's like a whole bunch of stuff going on. There's a component here of extracting stuff from scientific papers. There's a researcher agent, an engineer agent, an analyst. And then they take this to explore a big tree of architectures, 1,773 in a sort of evolutionary process. And yeah, I've seen some disagreement as to how big of a deal this discovery is. At least some people think that it's a bit of an overstatement to make this seem like a big deal. But regardless, I would imagine your take is part of the thing that people are excited about with regards to AI advancement is self-advancement. When are we going to get to a point where AI can do research on its own to get better? This is at least an attempt at showing that AI can do that now.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like this is why there's so much attention on automated AI R&D in the sort of meter sense. This paper, yeah, we're highlighting it because it did the rounds. It was a viral paper, one of the viral papers of last week when there wasn't much to talk about. I mean, honestly, looking at it, like there was one bit that caught my eyes. Like, I'm not sure that this is like as impressive as it seems. I have, short personal timelines on when AGI might be hit, but this does not scratch the itch for me personally. So this is a genetic algorithm type of philosophy, right, that they're applying. So they take a bunch of innovations that their researcher and their engineer and all that stuff put together. And then they'll take elements of them and kind of mix and match and then see what the fitness score is. Based on that, they'll decide which to breed in future generations. So if you're familiar with genetic algorithms, that's it. If you're not familiar, just know that like the fitness function is sort of like the core of this. It's sort of the thing you're optimizing for in some sense. Here's what they say. Architectures with losses greater than 10% below baseline are considered to have information leakage and are immediately discarded. Okay, so in other words, if you come up with a new architecture and oh shit, it does like suspiciously better than baseline, in this case they're saying 10%, then we go, okay, there must have been some information leakage, and so let's get rid of it. This is just buried somewhere in the paper. Whoa. If we're just like discarding architectures with losses that are 10% below baseline because you think they're due to leakage, how do you know there isn't a loss that's like at 8% or 9% below baseline that's also due to leakage? And since their big results are reached by iteratively following the loss through many rounds, with each round potentially being subject to leakage, doesn't the whole thing potentially just become a giant leakage stack? Naively, that's what it seems to me their own assessment suggests. Like they're obviously not confident in how they're preventing leakage from happening, which is really hard in an experiment like this. I'm not saying that it's because they're incompetent. It's just that maybe they bit off more than they could chew. Like it's just really hard to do. And you probably ought to guess that this is due to like kind of measurement artifacts rather than something huge. We'll see. Maybe I'll look like a schmuck. God knows it wouldn't be the first time. But that kind of was the thing that stuck out to me is like, well, wait a minute. Why 10%? How do you really know?
Yeah, exactly. You're not the only one to have pointed out this little brief detail. Information leakage, presumably meaning, some published research got through and that's just what the model did instead of actually being novel. But yeah, compared to other evolutionary type techniques, I guess the key here is using LLMs to come up with the code and come up with the novel directions to pursue. Yeah, no sort of huge breakthrough in terms of announcement, but potentially this is another indication of the sort of direction people are taking these kinds of AI research automated agents, where you're trying to combine a whole system and potentially are going to be able to kind of create a research team, so to speak, to make progress. Nothing huge so far, but GPT-5 is here. And maybe once we get Claude 5, it'll just work. Next, we have Meta evaluates Grok 4, another story that we're kind of catching up on from a week ago. So this is on that time horizon evaluation, showing for any given model how long of a task can it reliably, successfully do. And they evaluated Grok 4, added it to their kind of trajectory line. It's able to do slightly more than O3. So the 50% time horizon, the time marker at which Grok 4 is capable of doing the thing that takes that long 50% of the time, is now about 1 hour and 50 minutes, which is up from O3 at about an hour and a half. So this is, another kind of leap aside advancements, at least at the 50% time horizon. For the 80% time horizon, it actually doesn't make advancements beyond O3 and Opus.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's fascinating, right? I mean, so I was thoroughly confused about this, and this is one of the reasons that I was so excited about the GPT-5 launch is like, we'll get another point on that meter graph. We'll be able to see, does this one look as good on the 80%? So that one does. So GPT-5 continues the trend through 80%, and it's consistent with the sort of accelerated timeline with 4-month doubling time and all that jazz that we talked about. But interestingly, Grok 4 doesn't. And that I think is worth, in a weird way, it's a shame that we didn't pause longer on Grok 4 before getting GPT-5, because I think it would have caused a really interesting conversation where people would go, so which one matters more? Do we care more about the 50% or the 80% replication probability? And I'm not sure what the right answer is there, but Yeah. Sorry, there's like a whole podcast we could do about the distinction between those and why it matters. Bottom line is we don't have to do that now because GPT-5 gave us our extra point. So there you go.
Yeah, we're just continuing to update this chart. I don't know what you can probably search up when we initially discussed this. It's an interesting effort at trying to quantify basically the real world impact of potential usage of these models. GPT-5, they say, is able to do 2 hours and 20 minutes, something like that, at 50% success rates. For 80%, it's a bit higher, 26 minutes. So as you said, now leading the pack quite a bit higher than Grok 4 or O3, a Claude 4 Sonnet. Moving on to policy and safety, first we have a paper from OpenAI estimating worst-case frontier risks of open-weight LLMs. So they study the worst-case risk of releasing GPT OSS, and they talk about particularly malicious fine-tuning, where they attempt to elicit maximum capabilities by fine-tuning GPT OSS to be as capable as possible in bad biology stuff and in bad cybersecurity stuff. So biorisk, where they are training in an RL environment with web browsing. And then for cybersecurity, they're training in an agentic coding environment to solve capture of a flag. The gist is that GPT OSS may slightly increase capabilities, but doesn't substantially increase the risk factor of the leaks. So the decision to release model is informed by the idea that compared to other open source models out there, this is not going to significantly change what bad people might be able to do with it.
And then I saw some rebuttal as well, people saying basically like, if the theory of the case is that we're going to allow ourselves to release a model as long as it only slightly increases bad actors' ability to do damage, then this creates a situation where all the frontier labs are incentivized to incrementally increase the capabilities, the weaponizable capabilities of open source models. I mean, this is true. This is a very difficult hair to split. Some might not see it as a hair, but it certainly is like, there is nuance here. Part of which is like, you have these open source Chinese models right now that are the only ones on the market as open source. Increasingly, those are agentic models, which means people will be deploying them in agentic settings, potentially with dangerous behaviors baked into them that adversaries want to manifest in certain ways. So anyway, that's kind of all part of the debate back and forth there. Yeah, it is, by the way, pretty impressive on these benchmarks, including in particular biorisk tacit knowledge and troubleshooting. It is essentially beats perplexity, deep research, which is based on R1 plus browsing, pretty close to OpenAI O3 with anti-refusal and browsing. And by the way, the two things that they try here when they do their malicious fine-tuning, this MFT thing that they're sort of coining here, one is you can disable refusals generally and just generally jailbreak a model. The second is domain-specific capability maximization, or just basically fine-tuning the model on the dangerous capability you want it to develop. And these are two different kinds of fine-tuning that they have to account for, right? Get rid of the model's tendency to just decline to help you with bad things, and then separately make the model better at doing bad things. So all part of this sort of framework that you see them trying to sharpen here as they work towards implementing what is ultimately in their preparedness framework, right? This is a step that they're tying to that. So there you go.
Next one, another safety-related piece of research, this one from Anthropic, covered in some mainstream articles. The article title is Anthropic's AI Vaccine, Train It with Evil to Make It Good. That's the fun take on the actual research titled Persona Vectors, Monitoring and Controlling Character Traits in Language Models. So this is actually kind of related to some of the research, I think, from OpenAI we covered just recently that looked into this notion of, basically traits that models have in terms of being sarcastic or dishonest. And at the time, what we showed with this previous research is that if you just increase being sarcastic, somehow that makes you also misaligned in all sorts of ways. So this research is looking at monitoring the personas that a model has and then mitigating the ability to fine-tune personas that are bad. And yeah, basically this talks about the pipeline of data that is being used and would make it so it's harder to misalign the entire model with just a bit of tweaking.
I actually, again, week of insane stuff blasting. I did not see this paper, and I'm just looking at the Business Insider article about the paper, which is really confusing and uses very kind of like, it's very journalist trying to write layman language vibes. But reading between the lines, and we'll correct this if this is wrong next time. My sense is what's happening is that basically Anthropic like puts in a prompt and they get, obviously the activations in the model that result. Then they take up one layer, probably in the residual stream, and they would inject the evil persona that they have derived from using their sparse autoencoder strategy, which we talked about before and can talk about later if people read in that they want to hear more about this. But basically inject the evil persona, like add it at that layer, but keep the training objective such that like, hey, be harmless, basically, so that even with that injected activation that artificially makes, at least as of that layer, makes the residual stream evil, the rest of the model learns to compensate for that. So when you then remove it, essentially the model is like, it's forced to behave well under the circumstance where you inject evil into its brain. So it's like if I took a slice of Andrey's brain and I put in like an evil slice of my brain, but then like, I don't know, I gave Andrey some like re-education training to be nice. And then I took out the evil slice of my brain. And Andrey's like, oh, I'm extra nice now. And even if somebody put an evil slice of brain in me, I would still be nice. That's the vibe. Again, just my guess based on this pretty hard to parse article.
Yeah, to be honest, that was kind of what I was doing as per usual, trying to make it sound like I actually understand. Diving a bit deeper, the focus of the paper itself is more on monitoring as well as controlling.
Oh, okay.
So they introduce persona vectors. That's the kind of activation vector that indicates a model has a certain persona. And then what that means is you're able to monitor the model during training for the emergence of this kind of personality, and then also monitor the fluctuations of a model at deployment time, which means that you can then mitigate that happening by flagging training data, preventing it in the first place, or intervening when stuff goes wrong when you are able to detect. So this basically tells you another way to detect misalignment in, I guess, a more reliable way.
Well, now I'm curious about the thing that I said and whether someone's going to try that, because that sounds actually kind of interesting, and I wonder what would break.
Yeah. And next up, another result from Anthropic, and again, you're not as read on this. This is slightly older. This is going back 2 weeks, but I don't believe we've covered it, so I think it's worth mentioning. The research is titled Building and Evaluating Alignment Auditing Agents. The headline is they develop free agents that autonomously perform alignment auditing tasks. And when these models are tested against intentionally misaligned models, these auditing agents are successfully able to uncover that problem, right? And so this is pretty much what it sounds like. If you worry about misalignment, if you worry about models being bad, one way to try and prevent that is to have some other AI do a bunch of tests automatically to detect it. This is Anthropic taking a stab at it and showing that, at least to some extent, you can make that work.
On the lightning round, we have this research note. So not a paper, but then again, even papers aren't papers, so let's just call it a paper. Optimizing the final output can obfuscate chains of thought. So this is by, I think Alex Turner was part of this. He was like one of the original guys who did research on, yeah, there he is. Yeah, sorry, Turntrout is his handle, but it's Alex Turner and a bunch of other folks. He's one of the original researchers on the power seeking research that we may have talked about a while ago. It turns out that if you take a model and train it to, for example, they train a model to, what's the word? Oh yeah, okay. I'll give you a task. Sorry. I'll start with the task description. Give a model a description of different objects, like a shiny wooden cube or something, and tell the model whether or not that object triggers a detector. And then you're going to give a bunch of examples of that to the model and essentially have it become a classifier, have it predict, given a new object, whether the detector will be triggered. But now what you do is you penalize the model for using the word detector in its final output. All you care about is the final output, not the chain of thought. You penalize the model for using the word detector in the final output. What you will find is that the model uses the word detector less in its chain of thought, which is interesting because you never use the chain of thought as an input to your reward, right? So they're calling this spillover. Basically, the thing that you are optimizing for, the property that you're optimizing for in the part of the output that you're evaluating spills over into the part of the output that you are not evaluating. And they do this in a bunch of different settings and not worth going over the details. So super interesting. One of the implications here is we want to, like, ideally not optimize the chain of thought to look pretty or nice or whatever, because that will tend to cause models to obfuscate. If they're hatching evil plans, we want them to write those evil plans in plain English for us all to see. So one solution people had proposed is, okay, fine, well, let's just only use the actual output as the thing that we reward and reinforce on, and not use the chain of thought, so the chain of thought can be free and honest and all that stuff. This is showing you that that actually is not sufficient or may not be sufficient. It's also testing a proposal for an alignment strategy that Dan Kokatayo proposed, I think, a couple months ago, which is really cool, called Mind plus Face, which we should talk about at some later point because we're running out of time. Good.
Running out of time, lots to talk about. So moving on to another one of our favorite topics, compute and China. Got a couple of stories on that. First up, from Epoch AI, why China isn't about to leap ahead of the West on compute. Basically what it sounds like, this is more of an analysis piece than news that covers the various factors, the manufacturing side, the software side of why China is not likely to overtake the West in terms of the frontier of, let's say, like removing the need for Nvidia to be on the cutting edge of AI compute. It's a fairly detailed piece that covers probably what regular listeners who already know in terms of the factors at play. But yeah, if you're interested in getting a bunch of details and getting into slightly more of the nitty-gritty of things like CUDA, this article has that.
Yeah, it's a shame because this is one of those articles where, like, the actual value is in the details, and then the superficial description is going to be like, you already know this. The one thing I'll say is that, like most Epoch AI research, one of the most interesting things about it is that they bother to plot and analyze the, like, doubling times or like how quickly, like, flop per second or like compute power is growing over time, how their compute efficiency is growing over time, comparing it to how compute efficiency has been growing over time in the West, and kind of like drawing lines and having them intersect. So if you're into that kind of stuff, as I am, you will find this really exciting. You won't find anything qualitatively surprising here. Photolithography is the big thing that China's missing. No surprise. They're making progress on everything that's not that. It'll take a couple of years before that really has an effect. And probably we shouldn't be exporting Nvidia chips to China as a result. It's sort of the subtext.
And next story, inside the summit where China pitched its AI agenda to the world. So this is covering the release of the Global AI Governance Action Plan from late July, which happened at the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai, which I wasn't aware of personally as a thing that happened, but apparently it's a major event for AI kind of personalities to gather, including major prominent Western figures like Geoffrey Hinton and Eric Schmidt. And the gist is that China, at least in the statements and in this action plan, very much advocated for cooperation, coalition of major AI safety players, co-led by China, Singapore, VK, and the EU. Yeah, in contrast to the US, with the US AI action plan kind of, going the opposite way, very much going US as a lone figure in the space. Yeah, it seems to be, I don't know, it's hard for me to understand how meaningful this is, but there is a contrast to be seen between the US AI action plan and this global AI governance action plan, clearly.
So the US AI action plan often is kind of like mischaracterized as not caring about safety, whereas what they do is actually like they call for investments in basically AI alignment research, AI control, and monitoring mechanisms to detect if things are going haywire, and contingency plans as well for what to do if they do. So this is like, it's not a government that's going, whatever. It's a government that you can model as saying, well, like, we're skeptical, we don't know, but we're maintaining intellectual sort of, I don't know if intellectual humility is the right term, but like we're uncertain enough that we're going to keep our finger on the pulse here. There was some international engagement stuff on the chips side in the action plan. There wasn't much in the way of like, hey, let's coordinate around safety. And that's where this sort of sentence from this article comes in when they say, with the US out of the picture, because there was no sort of senior representation from America there, quotes, a coalition of major AI safety players, co-led by China, Singapore, the UK, and the EU, will now drive efforts to construct guardrails around frontier AI model development. Now, it's not clear that that actually is meaningful, given China's involvement and also the fact that the United States, if you ignore their labs, kind of is like the most important player, arguably. So apparently also, it's not just the fact that the US government was not there. There also wasn't representation from the leading frontier labs. Only XAI sent employees to the forum, which, I mean, if I heard that a bunch of like OpenAI and Anthropic people were there, I might be slightly worried that they didn't all bring burner phones and laptops because this is like China. But, it seems like this is a kind of China sphere sort of validation piece. Another piece, there is this guy, Brian Say, who is one of the founders of Concordia AI. This is like a Beijing-based safety like research company. And he has been in this for a long time. I remember talking to him like years ago, just when I was trying to understand the lay of the land. So they're claiming many Western visitors were surprised to learn how much of the conversation about AI in China revolves around safety regulations. Quote, you could literally attend AI safety events nonstop in the last 7 days, and that was not the case with some of the other global AI summits. Part of this is also that China has a particular interest in controlling the outputs of these models for political reasons, a kind of zero tolerance for references to Tiananmen Square or the Uyghur situation. And so that kind of creates more of an impetus for them to clamp down on the narrow behaviors they don't like, while, make no mistake, having absolutely no guardrails whatsoever for the CCP's own use in government, in defense, in kind of national security of these models. And that's one sort of distinction that they do weaponize quite effectively. They'll be like, hey, we're imposing all these like safety guardrails on our models for our domestic companies. And there are folks in the West who get excited about this and go, oh, China's serious about safety. But of course, in China, what matters is how will the government use it? And you'd better believe there's not going to be guardrails on government use of the technology. So it's a bit complex, but people are talking about it. I don't think that's a bad thing. Just got to keep the caveats in mind.
Right. And there's no meaningful kind of updates in terms of events, but it does speak, I think, to positioning, framing. Lately, it's been an interesting development this year with China being the source of the leading open source models now, basically in the West. And this kind of political effort on engaging with other institutions and collaborating and so on is another potential effort to sort of have a sphere of influence in AI beyond being a singular kind of closed off player. Last story, of course, we've got to talk about export bans and stuff like that. Nvidia H20 GPUs are reportedly caught up in the US Commerce Department's worst export license backlog in 30 years. Billions of dollars worth of GPUs and other stuff are in limbo due to staffing cuts and communication issues. So that's a very long title, pretty much telling you what's going on. There is, a real delay and a difficulty in shipping with chips, and particularly not just to China, but other regions, as there's the need for approval for these export licenses.
Yeah. My personal take on this is actually a mistake in the first place for us to be shipping GPUs to China, especially given stuff like what Epic surfaced in their report. What everybody's basically flagging is like China actually cannot make or has no line of sight on catching up to
Nvidia to the West, yeah.
Exactly. That's it. And so the frame has kind of been, well, so let's ship China GPUs that are like considerably worse than the GPUs that we can use here. But I mean, in my opinion, the frame ought to be, let's ship China GPUs that are just marginally better than their best domestic GPUs. It should be more of a ceiling than a floor, or floor ceiling. I don't know, something like that. And that's just not what's happening right now with the H20, which I think is a shame. The other thing is that like China could even fab like effective systems like Cloud Matrix and that, but their challenge is doing it at scale. So they literally can't, even if Nvidia like H20 GPUs were a lot shittier than they are, they just are benefiting from the excess capacity and having these things fabbed, for example, like TSMC and not SMIC. So I think those are like real issues. I think this is it's a real shame, but I understand why. So the theory here is something like, we don't want Huawei and SMIC to then have dominant market share in China and then eventually ramp up capacity to be able to compete with Nvidia elsewhere. The thing is, that's, I don't think, at risk of happening anytime soon. And historically, the way the Chinese supply chain has worked is we've done things like block off narrow parts of their supply chain, but not others, which creates like tons of economic pressure on both sides of the supply chain to support the closing of that gap. When there's just one part of your supply chain that you're missing, you have buyers and sellers on either side who are willing to like help co-invest to build up that ecosystem. Whereas if you just nuke the whole supply chain and like carpet bomb it, which arguably is what we should have been doing like starting 5 years ago, then it just creates a much harder circumstance. I don't think that there's a world where China could possibly be putting the pedal to the metal harder on domesticating their AI supply chain anyway. So it's not like us selling them NVIDIA chips in any way reduces the amount of dollars or effort that is going into the SMIC Huawei kind of complex. So I don't see a policy win, frankly, in this. Again, I understand the reasoning behind it. I just don't see this materializing in the way that is hoped for, but maybe I'm wrong, and we'll just have to wait and see.
It also doesn't seem like it's in any sort of intentional thing. This is kind of showcasing the state of the U.S. bureaucracy, or so to me.
Yeah, this particular thing, yeah, you're right. It's just like bureaucratic incompetence, like failing to, yeah.
I did want to address one listener comment real quick. There was a review on Apple Podcasts titled "The Politics of the Internet," where it begins with "have to disagree with your discussion of internet data causing chatbots to lean liberal." And then it basically goes into various kind of topics related to what typically Democrats versus Republicans in the US say. So I just want to clarify, when we say chatbots lean liberal, this is drawing on studies that show that if you ask chatbots various questions and see what sort of ethical and moral values they align with, they tend to go more sort of Democrat friendly than Republican friendly. This is like well known. When you say bias, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad or wrong. This is just how these models tend to behave. They're more in line with Democrats. So this is not to say that they say false things or, are somehow bad, but they are going to agree with Democrats more than they are going to agree with Republicans.
Yeah, it is something that we have to like face honestly. Like there's a lot of studies that have been done, including from sort of organizations that lean left a little bit more. There's a famous study. This is an organization that leans left, but the Center for AI Safety did a really big one that was pretty decisive in terms of carving up, like, these models very clearly seem to, and had really good methodology. We covered the paper on the podcast actually, but a bunch of others have come out since. And it's pretty obvious too, if you just interact with the chatbots, you'll sort of see like there are all these examples of, if you ask a question about Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump back in the day, this is just like not the labs trying to do this necessarily, as you said. It's just like, just think for a second about the demographic of who's online, right? Skews younger, skews towards people who live in big cities. Well, statistically, that means quite overwhelmingly Democrat voters, right? So it's just a function of where your data comes from. And that makes it, by the way, incredibly hard to come up with. I mean, we don't know how to make an unbiased reporter as a human being. Like, that's not something anyone knows how to do. So you can imagine how impossible it is to do with AI systems. It's just kind of like what you
I think it's a good point, right? Like, if you try to make it perfectly neutral, then it's just going to refuse to say anything on most topics, right?
Exactly.
So again, bias is usually considered a negative term. This is more of a descriptive term, you could argue. This comment also talked about Grok a bit. So this is drawing on the whole conversation about Grok. To be clear, I don't know if this was obvious. I am quite critical of the way that Grok has handled misinformation or being maximally truthful. They've done some things that are questionable in that regard. So didn't want to imply that Grok is addressing a problem by kind of correcting it.
Yeah,
different story.
You can think of, all these models are just applying, or these labs are applying like a different philosophy and a different lens, right? Like, ultimately, we don't know what the one true way to do this is going to be. And to some degree, maybe having different lenses on it is probably a good thing, in the same way that you don't want to consume all your media from like either like Fox News or CNN. You want to like have a nice balance, right? Sort of similar idea here. Because there is no answer, the only answer is the meta answer of have a balanced media diet or a balanced LLM diet. I don't know. That's a half-baked thought, but like, this is just a really hard problem. It's harder than it seems.
Well, that's the episode. An exciting week, and we'll try to stick around next week as well, not skip any more for the next while. Thank you so much for listening. As always, we appreciate it if you give us feedback, if you share the podcast, all of that. More than anything, please do keep tuning in.
Break it down. Last week in AI, come and take a ride. Get the lowdown on tech and let it slide. Last week in AI, come and take a ride. Our labs to the streets, AI's reaching high. New tech emerging, watch it surge and fly. From the labs to the streets, AI's reaching high. Algorithms shaping up the future seas. Tune in, get the latest with these. Last week in AI, come and take a ride. Get the lowdown on tech and let it slide. Last week in AI, come and take a ride. Our labs to the streets, AI's reaching high. From neural nets to robots, the headlines pop. Data-driven dreams, they just don't stop. Every breakthrough, every code unwritten, on the edge of change. With excitement we're smitten. From machine learning marvels to coding kings. Futures unfolding, see what it brings.